All right, all right. Good evening. Hey, everybody. How y'all doing? Oh, come on. Good evening. How y'all doing? Good evening. Hey, Lisa. I am Dr. Ron Manigo Bryant. I'm the director here at the center, and I just wanted to welcome you very briefly. I will not be before you long. Um, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And really, this is like the second in an installation of conversations really around the exhibit that you can see next door. If we must fight, we will die to the death. If we must die, excuse me, we will fight to the death. Resistance and revolt aboard the slave ship, which Dr. Joseph Jordan, who's here, raise your hand, Dr. Jordan. He's like, why? So, raise your hand, Dr. Jordan. He curated the exhibit next door, right? And so this is a second of conversations in carrying on that theme and thinking about what resistance looks like. And I want to just bring your attention very briefly just to say that our first conversation on February 2nd, when the exhibit opened, was with Marcus Rediker, who got us to think about histories from below. What does it mean to think about archives as a way of thinking about the way that we think about activism and protest in a current context? And then third, we have our third installation coming up with Dr. Lisa Lindsay, who's here in the audience, on March 30th, right here in this room. She will be giving the last of our three conversations around the exhibition, which runs until April 30th. So I am going to get out of the way because our esteemed guests are going to be introduced, and I'm actually going to pass the mic and the podium to Selena. Selena, who is our wonderful program assistant who's graduating in the spring, who is a public policy major, and is really a wonderful asset to the center. So I'm going to turn it over to Selena.
Thank you, Dr. Ron, for my own introduction. And it is my honor to first introduce one of UNC's great professors, Dr. Tanya Shields, who is an associate professor and the director of undergraduate studies for women's and gender studies here at UNC. She's been a past fellow of the Carolina Women's Center Faculty Fellowship and a recent recipient of the Institute of Arts and Humanities Academic Leadership Fellowship. Dr. Shields earned her PhD in comparative literature from the University of Maryland at College Park and is an accomplished and highly regarded scholar. She has published in a number of different venues, including the journals Souls, Women, Gender, and Families of Color, and Identities, among others. Her 2014 book, Bodies and Bones, Feminist Rehearsal and Imagining Caribbean Belonging, examines the ways in which rehearsing historical events and archetypal character shapes belonging to the region using feminist rehearsal as a methodology. Currently, Dr. Shields is at work on her second monograph, Gendered Labor, Race, Place, and Power on Female-Owned Plantations, which is a comparative study of women who own plantations in the Caribbean and United States South. In the broadest sense, Dr. Shields' teaching and research focuses on Caribbean studies and plantation logics, which is one of the many elements that makes her a perfect conversation partner for our esteemed guest, Dr. Mustakeem. Dr. Sowande Mustakeem is an associate professor in the departments of History and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, native and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, she went to Elon University down the road in Burlington, where she became the first person to graduate with a degree in African American Studies in 2000. She earned her master's degree in African American Studies at The Ohio State University and her PhD in the History Department's Comparative Black History program at Michigan State University. Dr. Mustakeem has articles published in the Journal of African American History, Atlantic Studies, and a number of essays and edited volumes. She has been featured on BBC Radio, was on Henry Louis Gates' PBS documentary series, Many Rivers to Cross as well. She is also co-host of the Apple podcast, The Book Lane 365, which empowers future writers with tips and tools to activate productivity through writing. Notably, Dr. Mustakeem is a historian with broad specializations in slavery at sea, medicine, Black women's history, terror, violence, slavery and memory, criminality, policing, gender, and executions in history. She is globally known for her award-winning book that we'll be discussing today, Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage, which was published in 2016 and which won the Wesley Logan Prize, jointly awarded by the American Historical Association and the Association for the Study of African American Life for the best book for the history of the African diaspora, and the 2020 Dred Scott Freedom Award for the historical literacy excellence from the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. And the audio version of Slavery at Sea was released in spring of 2021. And this is as a personal note, but as someone who was a part of the team working on the gallery next door, and who had a part in helping on the curatorial side of the gallery, I want to emphasize the importance of both scholars, and particularly Dr. Mustakeem's findings to the work of the exhibition next door, and to our furthering understanding of the transatlantic slave trade overall. And also, as a student interested in history, Black feminism, and writing, I'm excited to see such exemplary scholars, both of whom are Black women, in conversation today, and in conversation about topics that we can never afford to be silent about. We are thrilled to have you both here and cannot wait to learn from both of you.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Welcome. It's International Women's Day, so it's a wonderful day to be having this conversation. I also want to just reiterate a couple of things that Lauren said earlier, which is that Lisa Lindsay, who is here, will be here on March 30th, the same room, the same venue, talking about women as victims of the trade. And once again, just to reiterate that next door, if you haven't already seen it, is a wonderful exhibition called If We Must Die, We Will Fight to the Death, Resistance and Revolt Aboard the Slave Ship. And you can also purchase this fantastic book right there at the back of the room. You don't have to go far. You don't have to, go to Amazon. You can buy it right from us. And I hope you buy many copies, not just for you, but for family members, because it's a really excellent and wonderful book. And I learned a tremendous amount. So yeah, it's fantastic. And also, I think if you want other references about this information, there's actually a case in the exhibit with a lot of the books that I think informed what happened, what was put up on the wall. So please, go see the exhibition and buy some more of those books. But I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm really excited to chat with you further. We talked a little bit on the phone, and it was great that we sort of had similar ideas about where we wanted this talk to go. And one of the first questions that I had was, beginning with your opening dedication, memory is a central idea in Slavery at Sea. What does memory mean in the historical process? And what does it mean to, quote, infinitely remember the collective lives of those you study? And that infinitely remembering the collective lives comes from the dedication of the book.
Well, thank you. Thank you to everybody being here. Thank you for seeing value to have a conversation about the slave trade. And for me, I'm very intentional with everything. So International Women's Day was exactly where I needed to be. And then here we are in this moment. The dedication, I wanted to thank you for starting there. I'm amazed at how many people overlook the dedication. There's dedications all throughout the introduction, but I had to start with the multitudes, the many that we can quantify, and also who we forget. And I was very intentional to use the word infinitely beyond time and space, not just while writing this book. It is living with it. It is the memory well within the moment and far beyond. So here we are, 4 centuries later, really trying to make sense of it. So for me, memory and the memory making process, and I think we know now, it's already become extremely political and it's changing. Oh, really? It's become so political that the generational side of it is becoming even more reinforced. About 20 years ago, 30 years ago, what was the approach to education, teaching, and where are we within the American educational system? And so for me, it was creating and writing in such a way to make people feel and not forget. You'll remember you threw the book against the wall that you felt. And that was intentional. I chose the most horrific stories. There's no rainbows, no lollipops at all.
Right, and I think.
Okay.
Sure.
Which one? This one? The house?
All of it is the things we academics go through.
Okay, how about now? Is it? It's
It's still
similar.
there, but it's better. It's bad. Yeah.
Hello? Hello, goodbye? Is it because of two?
Like operate.
No, wow.
That's better.
Hello?
Yeah.
All right, that's good.
That's a lot better.
See, studying slavery at sea, it's always a little complicated. That's okay, though. We work through it.
No,
All
but
right.
It's interesting how we sort of had to attend to your body and the mic. And one of the things that you do in the book is attend to bodies.
Yes.
Like the body is such a central archive in your work and throughout the book. And I would like you to talk a little bit about how, about archives in general and
Oh,
what
yeah.
we get from archives, what kinds of sources we get. Because I think that's another thing that I really enjoyed about the book with the range of sources that you used. You know, you used wills and ledgers, newspapers, diaries, but you also use the body. And so tell us how you read the historical body, because I think maybe we're used to reading contemporary bodies, but we're not used to reading historical bodies.
Wow.
So say a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. To center bodies is to center people. We've gotten almost lost in the commercialization of it, the conflating of people into one without understanding the variance of scars, the variance of trauma, the variance of the gendered experience aboard slave ships. So the body came into even more concrete understanding at the end, as I really began to think about how all parts add up, how all different body parts are represented, not only in the telling of the story, but even more as we think about the detonation of violence in different ways on, within, and throughout the body and one's body and soul and mind. So the body for me is from the beginning to the end, from the point of capture to the point of sale. But we're also thinking about unhealthy bodies, thinking about bodies that have endured violence, bodies that are unable to stop the violence being detonated against family members. So the body for me is people, but then also the individual, which then also, as we've talked about, it really goes into a memory, and then how that becomes its own other sort of history and body making of a people.
Right. I think one of the chapters where, I mean, like you say, it's throughout the book how different body parts sort of structure chapters. But I think one of the chapters that, well, many of the chapters spoke to me, but one that in the very title is the blood memories chapter, you know. So maybe talk a little bit about how you even came up with that title to frame that particular chapter. But that chapter also, like the whole book, is really great about the interconnections between race, class, and gender and memory. So can you talk a little bit about what you were thinking as you crafted that chapter and why making the connections between race, gender, and memory so significant for you?
Thank you. Blood memories is where I tell people that's where you are thrown into the deep end, there forward. We made it
That's
to
no
the
lie.
ship. It is no
No
lie. It is about to be very deeply shadowed. Because of how I approach the memory of violence, the memory of blood, and then the meaning I made of violence itself was meeting people at this expectation of slave ship revolts. And to put females, a part of it is to rewrite the telling of shipboard insurrection. But then also to think about violence against children, so murdered infants, thinking about what I call the violent limits of Black motherhood. And then also to think about within that section where I call the art of sedition. Now we're getting at, again, I'm trying to meet people, it always trying to meet people what we know and then what we think we know. And then just trying to further expand out and deepen it in that way. So to think about hangings, to think about abortion, and to also think about, again, just the taking of one's life, and then also the violent moments that one would detonate on themselves. So it was very layered in my intention to center violence in different forms while also showing the global echoes through newspapers that are informing the world about these savages that are creating violence. And then it only emboldens further justification. So the memory is unending, the blood, thus the cover. The blood is unending, the bloodshed, and really keeping that at the forefront as we're going forward. Now, I want to explain too that that chapter left at the average person, all resistance would have been in that chapter. Because I would hear people say, tell me about the best of the best. Who rose up? Okay. All right. So you're going to tell us about the best of the best who arrived. And so the whole book was really trying to challenge that. Let's look at violence on its own, in its own chapter.
My mic, maybe turn that one.
Or
And I'll use the handheld. Yeah.
I know that's not supposed to be happening.
Take this one.
Yeah.
So now what?
Just put this, here.
Oh, okay. Sure. Hello? Ah, there we are. Somewhat.
Yeah, we apologize.
Oh, no, that's all right. I'm used to it. We just have to be in the flow. Okay. Yes.
So there are two places I want to go next, and I want to go back to the body a little bit because you also discuss disabled bodies and notions of refuge, what I found super interesting.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to talk and say more about how that discussion emerged because this disability studies is something I wouldn't say it's not new in the last 20 years, but it's certainly more pronounced these days. So how did it come into your work? I mean, it's sort of obviously there in the archive, but I think people have ignored that and haven't talked about it in the way that you do. So tell us a little bit about your thinking.
Well, thank you for that, because again, that's another category of people who I think about or overlooked, as we say, we already know. The conversations on disability of now, they're trending. However, I was among the very few who continued to show up looking and making us think about disability and the slave trade. And it always is sort of left to the side, we'll get to it. But I needed to think about it in the making and the unmaking of enslaved people, and then thinking about the costs and the consequences of the voyage itself. So some people may not even enter the trade that way, but then to leave the trade, missing an eye, missing fingers and toes, that needs to complicate our understanding of how people arrive. Again, there's no such thing as the best of the best. Yes, you arrive when you survive, but at the same time, the bodies have endured so much violence and trauma that the disability, in fact, does come from there. But for me, it really was trying to complicate our understanding of the collective of many, but also trying to save room for how people arrive really tells another story as we think about the category of refused slaves. What a concept. I ask my students, have you seen refused lately? No. There are plenty of trucks with the word refused driving around. And the throwaways. I need us to understand that there was a clearance sale that was created specifically for the unwanted that fueled the medical industry. I didn't go but so deep because I needed to save room for future students to be able to go further than me. And also because I wanted to end at the point of land. So then we can again better inform the future about the arrival, these vendue sales, and then also the brokers caught in the middle. So all in all, that whole category, what I did not expect is that I would be the one to censor that. And now there may be more books coming out. It needs to be, because it's a whole other category of slavery. What if you can't be sold anywhere? And then all of a sudden you and your grandmother are sold too. And then this physician from South Carolina comes down and buys you, and the next week and there's another. So there's a whole other untold narrative that directly connects to the slave trade in the world of plantations that I was really trying to do, and disability in the world of those refused, really concretized what I was trying to do.
And you mentioned earlier that you didn't shy away from the ugly stories or the challenging stories. You know, this is no sort of happy-go-lucky tale. And I think one of the places that we see this really clearly, as I was saying, is the Blood Memories chapter, specifically when you talk about the murder of children. And I have to say that was one of the most challenging chapters for me to read, about the brutalization and the murder of children. And I'm looking, you know, in my notes on pages 92 to 94, if you want to consult it when you get the book. You tell these stories of the way children, infants, are used against their mothers and used to sort of tame their mothers. And there's this horrible story about the killing of a child and the mother having to throw the child into the sea. And I could not help but think about all the state violence and vigilante violence against Black bodies in our contemporary moment as I was reading that. So I'm curious, as you know, we always say past is prologue, and you know, we get these lessons from history. Given sort of the violence against Black bodies in our contemporary moment, what do you think understanding the violence that began even before people were loaded onto the ships and the violence they experienced on the ships tell us about our contemporary moment?
Fundamentally, it tells about humans. And that is what I was trying to do, how far humans will go in the name of things, of material, of wealth, of legacy. And so to trace the long line of violence across 4 centuries within a sanctioned and very much invested industry parallels a world that we're in. Commercial worlds, how far we'll go, but then violence being so central in our nature to justify our everyday being. So as my mind really went even deeper in thinking about state-sanctioned violence. At the end of the day, state-sanctioned violence means that money went somewhere for that to happen. We forget the investment, not only in the hiring, the ships themselves, the movement of money. And yes, the people and the goods, but it is important to think about the business world. It was never interrupted. So what is sanctioned over and over with violence always comes with money. It's always coming with a broader understanding of how we're going to be, even if we need to meet it with violence. So when we can look at centuries ago how far people would go, then we can unfortunately come to understand ourselves even more, that during and even after so-called freedom, that violence is still the continuity that we find globally. Now, America definitely has its own brand that has evolved, and that would evolve, I would argue, in direct connection to the slave trade, because it does not begin on plantations. So the long line across centuries, following money, blood and money, completely, again, it only stopped once the money was about to begin to dry up. That becomes a whole other political conversation about even the ending of the slave trade. And as we think about the coming end, did that increase the violence? And then, so because, and even if we think about memory, we're often only in the 19th century, but we have to look at before the end came, what did it give rise to even more? And so the violence itself, I think, is still going to be difficult for us to quantify, but it is important in telling, because death, dismemberment, and violence, it is the most horrific that you can find in human nature. And then what does it mean when it continues to go on? And then again, the sanctioning of it through money. So that to me is the clear line. And that's where we're going to be going in the future. Do we give money? Do we defund? And what does the money say? What is the money doing in sanctioning certain practices? Okay. All right.
But
This one.
Yes. Maybe I'll just forget. Okay. Oh, yeah, here we go. So one of you just said in talking about violence in the book, you talk about, you discuss violence as, quote, the most tangible expression of making and unmaking. And
Hello? Okay. Well, first, let's start with the human manufacturing process, the system. What is it? And fundamentally, I read it as a business formula that is based on the warehousing, transport, and delivery. Fundamentally, that is manufacturing. That is a very commercial world. However, within that, the making of enslaved people and the unmaking of freedom, there's so much, bodies are unmade, minds are unmade, that again, at every point within the traffic itself, slavery is being remade all over again about now to be in my possession. You're going to understand what it means to be enslaved, to be denied, deprived of so much of humanity that will be lost in that. I want to go back to what did stir you up. It should. What a child thrown up, well, the whole book can stir us all up, stirred me up writing it. The black joke. You hear what I said? The black joke. That's the name of the ship where a 9-month-old was brutalized and murdered. And then his mother was forced to throw him overboard. And then for them to have to be burdened by her sorrow, we need to look at that. Now, I want to go also to where you've been asking about how the sources and the stories have been read previously. They've been read, they've been seen. However, the questions weren't about the people that I was interested in. To have the nerve to open up a book on the slave trade, talking specifically about Black females, that disrupts 120 years since Du Bois kicked this off. And I'm being intentional all throughout. A 2-year-old is not a woman. And we've got to really understand what is the world that females experienced as well as the variance of males. Where does age come in? So all in all, that's sort of like, yeah, where my mind is sort of thinking right now about that.
Yeah, this battery is about to die, and so it cuts out. But I think, you know, what you're saying, and you have said, one of the things I also loved about the book was that you not only talked about physical trauma, you talked about the psychological trauma, because I think that's something that we really lose a lot when we talk about this violence. We don't talk about the violence to the psyche. And again, can you maybe give us an example from the book about the violence to the psyche, and again, why it was important for you to have that layer of the story sort of shared?
Thank you. This is now speaking from the chapter Battered Bodies and Feeble Minds. From the violence, I needed us to think about the psyche. How does one cope with the shock of enslavement? And this forced me to really think about the seen, the unseen, the living, the dead, the coexistence of worlds, cosmology, just a variety of interiors of understanding that we carry, that people came into the trade with. And I open with a story of a man essentially trying to kill himself. And in that moment, this surgeon having to stop him. But then all throughout, we're having females and males while also introducing slave ship surgeons. How do they process psychologically how these females or how these males will respond? I mean, we're seeing different instances of people being tied up, chained in a whole other way in order to calm them down. It is interesting between the two trades, the American and the British trade, that each ship voyage would have different tactics. For some, it may be give them a little wine, maybe that can calm their nerves. Of course, and that's only going with what is available on the ship itself, but then to think that violence. But then there is, within that conversation, I really wanted to center discovery of these bodies. So there's a case of a Black woman who shared with her fellow female captives, that shipmates, what she was going to do, and that she was going home to her friends. And she would take her life, she would hang herself, and she, again, would confess this to her shipmates, and then for them to discover her body and then try to figure out what was wrong. Essentially, why wouldn't she want to stay enslaved? So then, to even think about jumping overboard, how everybody on the ship is still an investor. They're also a part, they're invested in this campaign that is completely against any notion of Black freedom. How did the crews respond when people jumped over? And in fact, the desperation is just so anchored throughout. But there's one case that I recently was thinking about where a woman had gotten off and they were like, damn her, let her go, knowing full well what was going to happen to her. And multiple people joyful, knowing you no longer have me, no, regardless of what lies beneath the waters itself. And more lately, I've been thinking about water is the most under sort of, we haven't deeply probed it enough to understand that perhaps it might be the most potent weapon in slavery, because you can't drink the water. You can't, and all you can do is either drown if you're not being saved. So then the irony, this is a point of travel. And then also knowing that seamen knew what that provided for them, which is a grave that essentially shows no evidence of whatever happened before.
You've taken me in so many different
Oh,
directions
good.
with this response. I mean, first of all, I'm thinking like there's a whole line of literature that's emerging about Black mermaids right now. Like a lot of
Oh.
the band Drexcia had this idea that pregnant women who were thrown overboard from slave ships gave birth underwater and gave birth to a new group of people called Drexians, who were guild African people under the sea, and what's his name? He was in David Diggs. He and a trans writer, I'm forgetting their name, they have a book about these people under the sea that's sort of based on this Drexian myth. So I think this idea of water, what it means, how it moves, there's a flow to the book that I felt like, yes, I was sailing along in an interesting way. But there are a couple things that I want to get back to. One of the things I loved about the book was also how you brought in the seafarers and, the sailors, the captains, and their role in this process. And you do this really great work with the sources where you're reading newspapers from both the United States and Britain, and about what the sailors are writing back home, but also what they're writing in the logs on the ship and how they're responding to sort of the what's happening on the ship. You also use terror as a structuring device in the book. So that's also something I want to get to. And I ultimately also want to get to, especially since it's International Women's Day, talking about the sexual violence on the ships. And you talk about prostitution, coercion, and rape. So I know it's a lot, but but before all of that, I want to start with your psyche. So you talked about the psychological damage of the people who were captives on these boats. But what did it mean to your psyche to go through these sources and have to call this story from the sources?
Thank you. The one magic question I continue to get. What was your psyche? I was very determined. There were too many people who said there wasn't a history. So that meant I took on a whole other job. That meant to find and to go to 25 archives. Let's start there. That is determined. And that is not Google. I had to go to a lot of different places, including I was here at Duke University, the best full comprehensive slave trade, a number of sources that I would highly recommend as well. Determination. But it was also really trying to answer this question: what was the slave ship experience like? So I'm okay with the blood. I'm okay with studying terror. In fact, I'm quite drawn by it. My next, where we'll go after this, is equally as bloody. So my psyche was just fine. I wanted even more. I wanted to find as horrific as possible, so that way we could figure out how do we scatter it throughout the book, weave it in to make it where it's a part of the tapestry within that memory making that I was trying to do. However, there were days that racially it just kind of hit too much. And that was only because I was the only Black person in tons of archives to be questioned about, why are you here? I've had archivists try to run me over, archive carts and everything. Oh, yeah, won't name where, but that only made me show back up the next day. Of course, I had to get over myself that evening. But at the same time, I know that I had to move past what could be anger that could hold me back, that could make me say, forget this. However, I knew if I can stay strong in this, then we can begin to be a part of the conversation. And so I was more driven by people telling me, this history's already done. We don't need another book. We don't need another Black woman. It just became all these please don't do this. And that only drove me even more. So to go to London, Liverpool, Jamaica, all over the US, I only had to stop because I had to finish the PhD, because I didn't feel, I felt like I need to know more. And try with the bibliography to show I sat for a lot of time really trying to make sense of something that makes no sense, how this could happen and continue for so long. So the archives, that's my playground. I love it. I can't get enough of it. However, it is reckoning with being a Black female studying the 18th century slave trade. That is very rare. I now am finding myself asking students, can you read cursive? Because if you can't read cursive, you couldn't go with me on these trips, because I was breezing through, looking at, all these letters in cursive, and really also having to move quick and to remember everything that I was reading. So the psyche, what is interesting is years later that it is very much a gift to remember. But my goodness, once you know and you can't unknow, it is there. So for me, it is having the big horizontal understanding of what really happened, and then trying to reckon with a world that is pushing back against the memory. So then I have more students showing up and they can't even answer when slavery ended. And then they don't even know when the slave trade even happened. So the archive was also me meeting the future to have to sort of think about the past, the moment, and then what do we do with them? And then as we go to the sources and then we think about the archives and the relics that remain, there is the irony that I have to go through the enslavers. I know I had used Jamaica Kincaid's quote to really say, let's consider that irony, that I'm left with the language of the enslaver. I am, however, I was able to read so far into those sources to look for the people that I would have wanted their story told, for them to tell it. However, having the variance of voices, whether looking at testimony before the British House of Commons, looking at the Seamen's diaries, looking at how surgeons wrote letters back demanding that they should have a more privileged experience, all of that within it, they always told something. So I was in the grab and go mode, which meant I have very little money. I have to be here. We have to be quick. So thankfully I could type fast. I was able to transcribe, this is even before you could take pictures in the archives, so it was a completely different process that you had to move quicker. And I wanted to make sure that many spaces were covered. So then also the best thing I could have ever done that only now has activated a whole unexpected future was including the medical lens. We've gone so long with it separate almost. And so then to put that a part of it meant that many people, so we're often trapped just in the ship captain and enslaved person. Then we forget about the crew. We forget about a professional, slave ship surgeons on these ships. But I will remind that the Americans saw no investment or the need in ever having a slave ship surgeon, whereas the British, by the end of the 18th century, in 1788, there was a bill essentially that required 2 slave ship surgeons per ship, but it really and fundamentally was to save white lives. But at the same time, that meant the presence of at least 2 ship surgeons on the ship. So it's the many people. And as we think about the crew, now going to sexual violence. And mhm. Oh yeah. Oh,
No. But let me answer sort of this last round of questions. I'm not sure where we are on time. We want to invite your participation as well. So if you have comments, thoughts, start to bring them together so that we can come out amongst you and get your comments, your questions, your ideas.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, thank you. Well, one thing I was thinking about is that a lot of these sailors were very accustomed to brothels. So the legal operation of prostitution, that they would have unending access whenever they wanted to pay for that. That's going to translate into this immediate access. And to stay in the trade meant that out in the middle of the ocean, who's going to regulate you? What is that going to look like? So in many ways, that became a whole other rite of passage that we're seeing that I argue for. And then it's just sort of how it's left as separate from an overall experience, but yet it is central as we're thinking about how Black females are viewed. Yes, even how Black mothers are viewed. Inferior mothers wouldn't be capable, always keeping children drunk, putting all these ideas in motion, and then to go so far with the violence that would be enacted. So to unfortunately have a case of a pregnant female who will be raped in front of a whole crew, and to see spaces known as the whore hole. That meant I needed us to understand that these ideas never went away. This is well before plantation. So we got to understand that there is a whole other group of people that are making this violent future that is continuous, and then we would never know a world without it. So it was really, again, trying to make deeper sense of the gendered nature of the voyage, while also thinking about those things that are seen and unseen. There's the things that we expect, but then there's also like the tokens that are given, these little small, wear some waist beads, and then that becomes symbolic ownership. She's mine. So it's a world of many that left unto themselves tells it's just a whole other empire of sex, of violence, and no regulation. The 18th century, the reason why I chose the 18th century is because it's the last legal slave trading century. And that is when you have the rise, it became the most least regulated branch of commerce in the 18th century because of the rise of private traders. That means centuries before you had government monopolies. So I wanted to know, how do everyday people come to find themselves a part of that? And then within that, what are the worlds that are made?
I think one of the interesting things when you talk about the seafarers, especially around this issue of prostitution and coerced sex and rape, is you talked about they have families back home that don't know what they're doing on the slave ship. But because of diseases, again, we go back to the medicalization, because of diseases that they may carry home and that they bring to relatives on board the ship. So yeah,
yeah, no one's gonna ask, where'd you get this venereal disease? Right. And then, yeah, that's not going to be asked, but also going very early, the loaning out of Black women. I mean, again, we're seeing many systems make others. So, hey, you want to come be a part of the trade? I'll give you this woman for your time, and so that only opens it up with these sexualized ideas and assumptions.
And I think is that a battery? So thank you. We're just going to share. But yeah, I think, again, one of the things that was striking and powerful to me was how understanding slavery at sea really gives us another dimension to understand what people, once they hit the land, how they had been traumatized in that crossing that was, months long. So it wasn't, like now we could cruise the Caribbean in 4 days or whatever. It was not. It was 3-4 months kind of thing. And to be in this confined space where you're sort of physically, emotionally, spiritually brutalized in this way, and you still come to land with some sense of yourself. I mean, some sense of, like you were saying, the best of the best, but they weren't the best of the best. They were the ones who survived and still held on to some notion of their own personhood, some notion of self. Another thing that I think you do so well in the book that really captured me was the way you invoked the sensory and the toxic realities of being in the dungeons and then being on the ships. And you really made us, you talked about the smells, you talked about what people would be eating. Say more about why it was important to you to sort of put us in that place where we could smell, taste the fear, the sweat, the vomit.
Oh, yes, thank you. So this is speaking to the whole book, but also healthy desires, toxic realities. So these merchants want the most healthy, but the reality of slavery is deeply toxic. And it becomes difficult. It becomes a part of the expertise of ship voyages. Ship captains. I needed to understand the diet in order to understand how people, like what was available, and really to move against the understanding that it will be something now. You can't have vegetables on a ship. Thinking about how meat is salted, and then thinking about the contribution of salty diets and very carb heavy, with the intent to fatten people up in whatever way in order to create, essentially it's engaging in a fraudulent trade. But then thinking about the arrival and that the inability to send somebody back, and then on the other side of it, thinking about, again, whether we're talking about the refused slaves or we're thinking about justice investment or the cheap investment of people's preservation, the health side of it continued to come out. And the sensory, I had to play up. How we need, as we're thinking about how someone would cope with the shock of enslavement, we have to think about the spaces that they're contained. We have to think about the water. We have to think about the ship. We have to think about the dungeons. And we need to think about the Vendu sales. We need to think about how normal it was for societies to smell ships coming. They're coming. Here comes some commerce. So thinking about what we would overlook. I'm the one who typically does find stuff hidden in plain sight. We forget the water. We're all about the ships. We're all about plantations, but we bypass the very process that landed Black people all throughout the diaspora. So, yeah.
I think I have a ton of questions. So if you all aren't ready to go, I can keep going. But I do want to invite you all to join us in this conversation. And if you would raise your hand, I'll come around. But I'm a cultural studies literary scholar. And so as I was reading your book, I kept thinking of Fred. I kept thinking of so many novels. The infamous Rosalie by Evelyn Trioux, who is a Haitian writer. But Fred Degar's Feeding the Ghost and M. Norbesi Phillips' Zong, which is about, and this is also part of the exhibition, about the revolt on the slave ship, the Zong. But Fred Degar also talks about the Zong rebellion, but from the point of view of a woman. And he talks about the seafarers. It was so interesting sort of reading your book, because his is like the fictional version of your book. So I'm curious, you end with your epigraph, you talk about Frankenstein. And so I'm wondering, did you have other literary influences that sort of informed how you put the book together?
Thank you. I'm a hardcore historian. So I have to say, in fact, it would go back to when I was in elementary. This is now thinking about Mildred Taylor. This is thinking about the writing of Blackness decades earlier. I was very much exposed to a lot of literature as a child. My mom was very much into it. However, I was so afraid of making sure that I had enough sources and getting it right that I needed to ground myself completely within the historical method. So that meant this very easily could have become a novel. However, I needed to ground it. I am in that tradition of Carter G. Woodson, which is to use the archive to begin to center the Black historical and historical experience. So yeah, I realize now that my book is in conversations with a lot of people I know about and a lot I don't. And then there is the exciting possibilities of what's coming. What will these books that everyone is being exposed to, what will this produce in the future with students engaging it in the production of memory, but then also for those who want to go that far to write, go get the PhD, to write for the future. So as a historian, I have to say that it was more history for me, quite a bit.
For me, from my point of view, it was definitely the literary, like I was thinking Hortense Spillers, Paul Gilroy, Omaseki Natasha Tinsley, like all these other scholars and thinkers who come from other disciplinary folks.
Yeah.
But please, who would like to, oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Your book is wonderful. It's like my go-to book anytime I'm writing. I just have some few questions. First, I wanted to find out how you understood or navigated the minds of enslaved persons on the ship. Because we know, yes, you spoke about violence as intrinsic in the slave trade, but then talking about trauma and how people reacted to their situations. In my work, I'm still trying to find a way to understand or read the minds of these people, but then it's really hard because the archives are actually silent. We see the ship captains talk about melancholy and find other reasons why enslaved persons, especially those who committed suicide, chose to do what they did. But then it's really difficult to, come to terms or find a better understanding of that. So I just want to find out if maybe you have ideas as to how to navigate through the minds of these people that are quite silent. And my second question is, with your work, putting it in conversation with Orlando Peterson's Social Debt, was this a frontier you explored for your book? Thank you.
Oh, Thank you. I gotta find the best way to answer this one. Again, going back to being so determined to center the slave ship experience meant going to different archives, but also recognizing what I was up against, that Black people are always going to come up. They just may be the afterthought of a letter. I mean, this is across the board. It's almost like the obsession with, let me give you a Black story, at least one. Every source provided that. So I was able to take what someone may be at the backdrop and bring them to the forefront, and then to tell a whole other story. Because I'm thinking about a surgeon who had written about his experience on a ship, and then he ended up talking about 2 women that were involved in insurrection, and that if given even a few more minutes, that it would have been all the women. I mean, his whole recounting of this. Surgeons are, to me, one of the most unexplored aspect of the slave trade that I want to really encourage other people to really pursue. It is multiple books that could be written about that. Now, that said, I always kept in mind the politics. So when I'm reading the government testimony before the House of Lords, the House of Commons, they may be trying to show that, well, I was involved only for a little bit, but they always ended up telling these extensive, sometimes even just small moments that would be so paramount to the narrative itself. So that meant I was open to the sources in other ways. Now, how does one best navigate the mind of an enslaver? Well, as I thought about the money, as I thought about, again, one, it helped for me to understand them better when it was legal. We're so obsessed with abolitionists and when freedom, and then the ending came, that I needed to understand when it was just normal, when for centuries, for 3 centuries, that it had been normal, but then it's the 19th century that it takes on this whole other tone. So that's where learning the history centuries before were important. I needed to understand what came before the 18th century. So what I would encourage is, think about the moment of what it is that you're studying. Think about the political influences. They're everywhere. And they're influencing even how trauma is understood, if it's even acknowledged, or if it's overlooked in the name of something. So it is important to step back, and for a while, to see the bigger horizon in order to begin to see how some people are in more conversation than they may seem. More dots may all come together. It's not easy studying the mind of anybody, let alone an enslaver. The best tip that I was never given that I will give you that helped me: learn to listen to the world and how it speaks and tells its stories. And when you learn that, it's like a whole other flow. So that meant there was a moment where I realized I was listening for the news and what's going on. And then my brain began to split, where I'm listening to what's the news, but how are they informing me about what is happening? How do we see language? Cosmic wink. How do we, again, study language across centuries? But again, that was a huge moment for me. I can't say it enough. Really listen to how the world speaks to itself and tells its story, and that gives you incredible language. I mean, right now, as we're talking about wars, it's helping me to understand a whole lot more of how wars evolve over time. And so again, just really immersing yourself in how it's looking at a multiplicity of optics on the brain itself. Again, I'm not certain what it is you're focused on, but nonetheless, just again, going broad and then going in deep, but look for the connectors. Thank you for the compliment too. Glad to know anything that I wrote would be a go-to for people. So thank you. Trust me, I was told I was a horrible writer. So this is coming full circle. I started here in North Carolina, and I was so unsure of my future. And now look, I left here 23 years ago, clearly found myself. So, so see the big picture and be determined. Okay. Okay, sure.
We have another two questions,
Okay.
but we're starting. But I do want to say for students, like it's a really, the book is such an excellent example of how we elevate, you know, so it really can be your go-to for writing. So see how the does it.
Thank you, Professor. I want to thank you for coming and offering your wisdom, and
Thank you for being here.
absolutely. I had a question. I know you said your psyche is good and was good during going through all of this sort of traumatic uncovering, revealing of the history of slavery. And you said that the determination of those naysayers basically pushed you forward to continue on. And I was still curious, even though you said that, did you have like a sister circle or like some family or just a circle of academia friends that you, when you were confronted by something, some challenge or adversary, did you just like kind of convene, or was there like some type of music you just needed to listen to kind of just come back?
Mhm. Thank you. There was different forms. In grad school, there was the world of other grad students. So you're not alone. And that meant long nights together, writing all these chapters very quickly. And also talking through the sources, talking through, let me tell you what I found and how I'm thinking about it. So that was important. But then when I took my job at Washington University in St. Louis, then there was a whole other opening: meditation, drumming, community circles, I'll say, many types of people, especially hanging out with non-academics, because I needed to be able to have conversations and just be me, and also to gauge how other people are understanding what it is that I'm doing. So I'm very much a people person. I surround myself with all kinds of people, but I also recognize how I am. And how I am has evolved in this process. I almost quit academia. And in fact, Marcus Rediker, I give much credit to him, that there was a point where everything changed and I left for a 10-day silent meditation. I had warned the university that I was contemplating leaving because the book was being blackballed. There was all kinds of stuff going on. So you can imagine the psyche then. And I was taking care of my mom, a 5-time stroke survivor. So I don't know if I would quite say that my psyche was good, but I feel like I was used to it. I was okay, you know, in those ways, because I really was having to live with this. I still do. As I can't forget, I choose not to forget these stories within there. But one of the greatest support has really been my mother. My mother was there for me completely through the entire process. And even up through me submitting the book and then the book coming out. So there's a lot of life that happened, that before, during, and after, that has just made me come to recognize the diversity of ways to help. If we want to say self-care, radical self-care, I realize now it's trending, because some people want to hear you do bubble baths and massages and all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't know if you're really gonna have a whole lot of time for that, but maybe here and there. So it's just interesting the world we're in now, because I've actually was never really even asked about self-care for a long time. It would just be like, how did you find this? But now it is, what were the ways of my own survival in recognizing this? Because in writing a book, you're plunged back into a world. So that meant hours on end, I'm in the 18th century. So, you know, having to come back to, we're in the 21st century. Okay. So, you know, it is, again, just keeping people around me. And also I float. I don't know if you ever heard of floating. I float now, and, you know, just in writing retreats. Yes. Yes. So surrounding myself with different people. So thank you for that. I hope it'll be an inspiration for you.
Hi, thank you so much
Welcome.
for your book and your scholarship and your work and your journey to bring the book through the world. And thank you also, Tanya, for the conversation. My actual question relates to that part of the way that the Stone Center is presented, this format, as opposed to, let's say, a monologic, a more dialogic format. I find that so productive. And so you partly answered it when you were talking about different circles or people together in terms of as you got through. But I'm wondering if you have any stories about like working with a particular archival source, right? Since you mentioned all the various archival stops, and then talking to people who were both historians as you are, or who weren't historians at all in your various circles, or even talking about a very specific source you found with your mom even. And if that conversation, that dialogue transformed how you told a piece of the story, not the whole book, but a piece of that story or a piece of how you wove things together. And the question came from your response to Tanya's question about other kind of, let's say, writers or poets. And you said, I'm a hardcore historian and I really hew to the historical method. And that made a lot of sense to me, thinking about the kind of pushback to you specifically doing this work, that in order to get the book through in the world, the kind of, I'm with Tanya, I'm over on the literary critical poetry, but it made sense to me that you, in a sense, couldn't afford to take that kind of, that kind of detour as much as someone like me might want that, right? And so I'm wondering if there are other ways that there were openings, right, in your encounters with the archive that were dialogic or more, I don't want to use the word creative, but less so strictly needing to be hewn to the historical method that then maybe you couldn't cite necessarily in your book. Do you understand? I mean, like, I understand the historical citation process is very, there's certain, you get my question?
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay.
So I want to start by saying that actually I have a master's in Black studies. And then when I graduated from Elon, in fact, I was the first person to ever get a degree in African American studies. I did an independent major. Thank you. I think I'm still the only one though. So not surprised. But I want to start with the story about dialogue. Oh, my mother got an earful. She's like, oh gosh, I feel like I've had to hear about 5,000 dissertations. "19 years ago, there was a conference, the New England Slavery and the Slave Trade Conference. And at that time, I didn't do the American slave trade. I only did the British. And my advisor was like, you better find something because you need to be there. Whoa, hold on now. I don't have it. Find something. And so I was reading Lorenzo Green's book on Negroes in New England. And there was only a paragraph about a Black woman that had allegedly been thrown overboard off of a slave ship by a Rhode Island slave trader. And I thought, that's bad. But at that moment, it didn't seem as horrific as what I had already been seeing through all these other sources. However, one day I ended up waking up with a whole new pair of spectacles, if you will, and I became quite obsessed with her story. And then there was a time where I called my mom and I was like, oh, this woman's story is haunting me. And then yet I don't know whether to do an article, put it in the book, this, that, and other. She said, you are supposed to tell her story. This woman went through an agonizing moment that I and probably a whole lot of people could never and would never write about because you'd be too angry. You're supposed to tell this story. And then my mother suffered 5 strokes. And then one day I found myself deep in depression, 6 months after. Hadn't slept for 6 months and just questioned my whole future. So I was sitting at the desk and I just said, well, what would Velma have me do? It's my mom's name. And then I saw a conference paper that I had done another time on this woman's story. Next thing you know, it was just pouring out of me in all these other ways. this article would become my most popular article of everything I've written. That is what people held on to before the book. No American journal would publish it. No American journal saw the value to study a Black woman who died in the Middle Passage. However, a British journal would see value, and 9 months later, the quickest that I think academics know, we never get 9 months. That happened, and that changed the course of my career. So that became the beginning, and that woman's story. It was 1791. She unfortunately had contracted smallpox. She was seen as a threat on the ship. There's a documentary called Traces of the Trade, which is about a slave trading family from New York and them reckoning with their past. Well, their most wealthiest ancestor, who would die the second richest man in the country in 1837, was the one who was responsible for this woman's murder. He died a senator. And he also faced charges of murder. What he had done is he demanded that this woman be blindfolded and tied down to a chair and thrown off the ship. Because for him, there's no way to save the rest of the ship, and said to get this dangerously infected wench off the ship. And he ordered 2 sailors to go up with him, and then 2 others were forced to lower her off the ship, and they heard her hollering as she was thrown off. And so that became the door opener and the continued conversation I have with people. I continue to assign that article. And for my students, it's taken on a whole new meaning because we have very little understanding of quarantine in Black history. This woman was quarantined, and then to look at how she was treated both on the ship and off the ship. So I share her story because she's the doorway opener for me, and even more for the multitudes of people within the book itself. Okay, so then there was another side to the question that I had heard. Oh, did it? Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, I know. Was it? I guess I'm just trying to make sure I cover it all. Oh, well, great.
We have another question over
Okay.
here, but I want to
Thank
let
you.
I want to let folks know Traces of the Trade is available. If you're a student, you can watch it via our library. There's also a book, Inheritors of the Trade. Katrina Brown, who's the director of Traces of the Trade, it is her family. And she's reckoning with her family's history, and then a cousin of hers who went on this journey. Because what they do is they sort of do the Middle Passage. They go to Africa, and then they go to Cuba, where their family owned plantations, and they come back to Rhode Island, which was the family seat. And one of her cousins who goes on this trip with her, he's very resistant. And by the end, he sort of, has an epiphany, and he writes a book called Inheritors of the Trade. So if you're interested in that, the other thing I want to mention is there is a reckoning around universities and slavery, and UNC will be hosting a conference on universities and slavery, I believe next week. It's spring break, but if you're around, I hope you will come. But there's a question right here.
Thank you so much for taking the
Oh,
time to
yes.
be here and answer this question. Kind of similar to the previous question, your conversation of your work being a traditional history work. Have you seen your work applied in the field of public history? And if so, in what way, in terms of journalism or museum, historic sites, or things of that nature?
Oh, thank you. I think this is the first that I'm hearing. However, it could be more. I mean, my mind is blown that a multitude of books will be used to create something so dynamic in that way. We're not there yet. The book is 7 years old. It's going to outlive us. Now, where the future is going to go with memory, I think we know it's quite political. So there could be a day that maybe slave trade isn't taught anymore. How are we then memorializing within our communities? Can't be just one national African-American history museum. We then have to invest within our local archives, our local constructing of memory in different ways. So it's still coming. I'm so used to people don't want to deal with slavery or the slave trade that this is blowing my mind that so many people want to engage it because they'd be like, oh, yeah, get over it. Why can't we talk about the 20th century? Yeah, okay, we got to lead up to that. We got to get there. So, but thank you for that. Maybe there'll be other, requests for opening and moving the needle in new ways, I'll say.
And I think we could take maybe one more question. Again, I want to invite you all to buy the book, especially why we have Sowande here and she can sign it for you.
Oh.
So is there another question before we close tonight? And maybe as people think about their final question, you can tell us about your next project.
Oh, just you wait. My next book is looking at women in crime. I'm looking at women who commit violent crimes who were sent to the Missouri State Penitentiary. And I have uncovered a world that we've never seen. That's what I'm good at, finding that needle in a haystack. But that said, in many ways, it really is looking at how far someone would go. Now, this is after slavery. So this is really going to go in the 19th century largely, because I've uncovered an absolute gold mine of sources that largely medical, that tell us a lot about gun violence in 19th century St. Louis and in Missouri. So really it is putting a female context to how far violence can be detonated. And again, beyond the confines of slavery, but really thinking about different types of women. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but there's more coming. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, there are two more.
Okay.
Oh, you might- Yeah, she needs it for the recording.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, thank both of y'all
Yes.
for your time and your speaking. I think my question specifically is about memory
Mm.
and expanding memory, specifically to be more illustrative of the link between the culture aboard slave ships as being, you know, extremely influential in the South, speaking about like the antebellum society and thinking about how do we trace the link between culture on ship to culture on land?
Mm.
And how do we have our memories be more indicative of that connection?
Great question. That sounds like a dissertation. To be honest with you, really thinking about the translation of culture from that world of slavery at sea. But you're right to really ask, what does the memory look like? How can we deepen it? I think right now we're going to have to almost get more clear on our own playbook. Right now, the politicians have a real playbook going on that is digging into our world, whether within high schools, as we're seeing the political nature within the AP African American Studies, but then the labeling of terms, what something is or isn't. I always tell my colleagues that memory is going to be the money maker. It's just how you articulate that. And that has to then fall into almost something that other people can find themselves connected to. But then North America's never wanted to own up to its own past of slavery. So we still also have to continue to figure out what are the ways of memorializing that go within and beyond generations. There is the standard go to a museum, but then there can be other versions. So as we're thinking about water, we need even more underwater sculptures. We need even more. How can someone be in Australia and engage the memory making? What can the museums look like that are even more accessible for someone who may not be able to travel, who may not, be able to have those abilities in that same way? So we just have to get good and even more creative in that way. And for me, though, it is just getting students to the archives and letting them know that they are just as capable in the same way. The same thing that was done for me is what I do for students. And so I've continued to get students to the archive, but I'm also really trying to get all of us to understand, if we do not do a better job of memorializing our local histories and herstories, the doors will close, and then so too will the history. And yeah, so it needs to be national, it needs to be global, it needs to be local. And generational is my favorite word. Okay, we need to think beyond the generations of what it has been. Where can we go? And how can we bring these worlds together? So today, to me, seems to be that cross-generational dialogue. And the dialogue is what is always missing. So I'm very grateful that the format did allow for the exchange for all of us in this way, and even more that we get to be in conversation. Thank you.
There's one more.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you don't have, okay. Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming. We
Thank
hope you'll
you.
come up and maybe chat with the author, buy the book before you do. It's not the price of conversation.
Thank you
though.
all for
Thank you.
coming.
Good night. And then just now, when I turned it on again, see, the battery is flashing. It's saying there's no battery.
It comes back. It
But then
says
it
that.
goes out.
Well, you said it goes, but then if you,
But then it didn't always work.
I know, it's still on.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you. Sexuality. So you're like, it's really making some right? And I was got it. Right, 3:30. It's a handful of people. And it's not that kind of. Then they'll say themselves, even if you're like, please, we want your opinion, whatever. The idea that there's all of that. You're not.